Africans in colonial Mexico. Soiled Gods and the Formation of a Slave Society, page 21, second paragraph. In the 1540s and 1550s, Spanish commercial activities rapidly expanded throughout New Spain. The availability of land which Spaniards rented or purchased from the indigenous peoples acquired as land grants or simply appropriated through force and guile facilitated mid-century commercial expansion. As the Spaniards acquired more land, they maintained a tenuous grasp over their tributaries. Yet they never exclusively depended on indigenous tributaries for labor. From the colony's inception, the Spaniards employed various labor strategies, including draft labor, whereby a native community was obligated to provide uncompensated labor for a designated period of time, work for wages, and slavery, often relying on three simultaneously. By 1549, for instance, the resident labor force on Cortez's sugar mill in Tlaltenango included 186 indigenous workers and 80 enslaved Africans. During the 1550s, the Spaniards steadily increased their dependence on wage and slave laborers of various hues. By mid-century, commercial agriculture, livestock, estates, and mining industry essentially relied on multiracial workforce composed of draft labor, enslaved Africans, and salaried workers. The variegated labor force profoundly shaped the compensation of the community, the experiences of its members, and the formation of culture in New Spain. At mid-century, Africans were so numerous in New Spain that it alarmed the viceroy, Luis de Velasco. In 1553, he wrote Prince Philip requesting an order limiting the license for bringing blacks, since in New Spain there are more than 20,000 who are increasing and will eventually spread confusion in the land. Despite Velasco's warning, Spaniards annually imported over 500 Africans into New Spain. By 1570, the colony had received an estimated 36,500 Africans, of which 20,000 had survived. Among approximately 36,500 Africans who entered New Spain by 1570, 80% came from the Guinea of Cape Verde, and especially the rivers of Guinea. A census taker in 1570 reported finding 8,000 black slaves and 1,000 mulattoes in Mexico City, alongside only 8,000 Spanish males. The nearly 60,000 Nahuas residing in Mexico City's Indian neighborhoods, however, easily outnumbered both groups. Though disproportionate number of Africans and their descendants lived in Mexico City, by the end of the 16th century, they collectively rivaled, if not outnumbered, Spaniards throughout New Spain. In Puebla, for instance, the population of African descent constituted 40% of the non-indigenous population. In Veracruz, persons of African descent constituted 63% of the non-indigenous population. In Guanajuato, the 800 African slaves represented 66% of the Hispanic population. Even in remote Antequera, The descendants of Africans accounted for 31% of the non-indigenous population. These figures illustrate the preponderance of Africans in the 16th century Spain, New Spain, and also highlight their presence in urban centers. Africans also flourished in the countryside. In 1570, the census of Mexico included approximately 150 livestock estates, on which 200 Spaniards, 300 slaves, and 50 mulattoes resided. In Michoacan's diocese, which had 300 livestock estates and 2 water-powered mills, there was a population of 400 Spaniards, 200 mulattoes, and more than 700 slaves. The Tlaxcala diocese, in contrast, had 200 estates, 300 Spaniards, and 400 slaves of African descent. Oaxaca's diocese had 100 estates, on which 150 Spaniards and 200 slaves resided. Although imprecise, this census underscores the growth of the African and Creole labor force in the mills of Moroles, Veracruz, and Michoacan. The livestock estates in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, Oaxaca, Guerrero, and Michoacan, and the large coca plantations along the Pacific coast. After 1570, the presence of Africans and their descendants continued to expand throughout New Spain. The commercial economy fueled much of this expansion and transformed the social landscape. By the closing decades of the 16th century, events in Africa, Europe, and the Americas affected the cultural composition of the transatlantic slave trade's cargo. Because of political events and economic changes along the Atlantic periphery, the 17th century slave trade, which began in 1595, brought Africans to Spanish America, who were identified as Angolans. Although Portuguese slavers primarily transported Angolans to the Americas, they continued to ship Biafras, brands, Guilofos, Mandigans, and Terra Novas to Castile's various Atlantic provinces. The lingering West African presence among the Gonzales underscores Portugal's trading legacy in the Guinea of Cape Verde. By 1640, the Spaniards had imported over 110,000 ethnic Africans. For the period of 1521 to 1639, this amounted to little more than 900 per year. This longitudinal perspective, however, obscures the vicissitudes of the slave trade. Spaniards received more enslaved Africans during the first 4 decades of the 17th century than they had throughout the entire 16th century. Ebbs and flows also characterized the 17th century slave trade, 1595 through 1639. Which roughly corresponds to the union of the Portuguese and Spanish crowns. In 1609, and again in 1619, the Spaniards imported over 6,000 slaves, but between 1611 and 1615, they legally managed to acquire a total of only 476 Africans. Despite these fluctuations, the 17th century slave trade in New Spain averaged 1,871 persons annually. It reinforced the African presence while simultaneously augmenting the Creole population. By 1646, an estimated 151,618 persons of African descent inhabited New Spain, on which 62,814 resided in the Archdiocese of Mexico. In the Diocese of Michoacán and Tlaxcala, Africans and their descendants of various legal categories respectively numbered 23,480 and 22,915. The remaining 42,409 were dispersed throughout the Diocese of Oaxaca, Nueva Galicia, Yucatan, and Chiapas. I am sorry. Creoles clearly experienced phenomenal growth during the second half of the 16th century and the initial decades of the 17th century. In a 76-year period, 1570 through 1646, the Creole population grew 50-fold, from 2,437 to 116,529. Mostly free mulattoes, they constituted the large freed and free population in the Western Hemisphere, a position that Creoles maintained well into the 19th century. The 35,089 residents of New Spain who were born in Africa represented only 30% of the black population. The 116,529 Creoles accounted for the remainder. Creoles as Africans born in New Spain were known emerged as a significant presence soon after the conquest. Throughout the 16th century, the growth of the Creole population proceeded slowly but unabated. By the mid-16th century, the Creole population had proliferated to such an extent that the colonial authorities finally took notice. Despite the impressive growth of this population, initially it could not compensate for the high mortality rates among the descendants of Africans. Yet towards the end of the 16th century, steady growth among surviving persons of African descent augmented the expanding nucleus of Creoles. By 1650, this nucleus had proved a nearly balanced sex ratio in many regions throughout New Spain, which in turn sustained the reproduction of the Creole population. Ironically, as Creoles began to outnumber the African-born population, the institution of slavery became more tenuous. In fact, 17th century estate inventories underscore the existence of two population trajectories among persons of African descent. While the Spaniards imported significant numbers of Africans during the first half of the 17th century, the demographic balance gradually shifted in favor of Creoles and free mulattoes. By 1589, the heirs of Cortés on the Marquesado del Valles livestock estates in the Tehuantepec region had over 50 years of experience with African, indigenous, and Spanish laborers. In 1589, the full and part-time resident workforce included 41 slaves, 15 free mulattoes, and 19 indigenous wage laborers. Among the enslaved, there were 21 Gonzales and 20 Creoles. 10 years later, only 25 slaves remained. The population of free mulattoes and indigenous peoples had also diminished. by 1616, the presence of 32 slaves and 9 free mulattoes signaled the revitalization of Tehuantepec's African and Creole labor force. 6 years later, however, enslaved mulattoes ascended into the majority among the slave population, while free mulattoes rivaled and gradually eclipsed enslaved Africans as laborers. Despite new African arrivals, natural reproduction ensured that mulattoes retained their primacy among Tehuantepec's slave labor force. Between 1588 and 1629, for instance, mulattoes constituted 58.3% of the slave children born on the Tehuantepec estates. Despite these indices of growth, the decline of the slave population was irreversible. By the third decade of the 17th century, a permanent free mulatto majority had emerged on the Tehuantepec's estates that, together with the indigenous laborers, comprised the bulk of the labor force. The sugar industry in Morelos, which by 1570 had one of the largest slave populations in the Americas, experienced a similar pattern whereby Creoles gradually replaced African-born individuals as laborers. During the first half of the 17th century, the Spaniards steadily acquired more land, on which they extended the cultivation of sugarcane and constructed additional water-powered mills. The expansion of the sugar industry created a demand for more labor, and Spaniards promptly imported a mass of enslaved Africans. Consequently, the African and Creole population of Morelos soared to new heights. While older estates continually clamored for labor, the greatest demand came from owners of newly established sugar estates, well positioned at the beginning of the 17th century to compete in New Spain's labor market. Juan Fernandez de la Concha, for instance, rapidly accumulated slave labor for his growing estate. In 1616, Juan Fernandez purchased the Guajoyuca estate, which had no laborers at the time. 14 years later, his labor force included 80 enslaved Africans, making him one of the largest slave owners in Spanish America. Andres Mendez at Tijuan Estates, founded in 1627, grew even faster. A mere 5 years after its construction, his estate also included a labor force of 80 enslaved persons. Although persons defined as Angolans predominated among the African-born in 17th century ethnic New Spain, the slave labor force in Morelos was not exclusively African. Black and mulatto slaves had a significant presence on the estates of Morelos, and during the first half of the 17th century, they began to outnumber the Africans. Estate inventories reveal that the Marquesado's mill, Talatango, represented the only 17th century sugar plantation on which Africans constituted at least 30% of the slave population. Even on the newest estates such as Atahuan and Guajoyuca, Creole and mulatto slaves easily outnumbered enslaved Africans. In 1680, 64 years after its construction, the Guajoyuca estate had only 2 African-born slaves, 32 blacks and 30 mulattoes. Around the same time, the Atahuan estate included 10 Gonzales, 62 blacks, and 44 mulattoes in its slave labor force. Surviving estate inventories from Morelos reveal that an average blacks and mulattoes accounted for 81% of the slave population during the 17th century. The growth of the black and mulatto population did more than offset the waning African presence. It also contributed to the expansion of free mulattoes, who, along with the indigenous peoples, constituted the core 18th century labor force at Morelos. The African and Creole population of Michoacan experienced the same demographic pattern manifest throughout 17th century New Spain. By the 17th century, African slavery was flourishing at Michoacan. In 1624, the provincial capital Valladolid included 1,116 servants and 229 enslaved persons, distributed among 220 households. The majority of enslaved Africans and Creoles, however, lived on estates that grew livestock, cotton, tobacco, and planters. Oh, and of course sugar. During the first half of the 16th century, the sugar planters, the largest owners of slaves, enslaved 525 Africans and Creoles, distributed among 14 estates. The largest concentration of slaves resided on an unnamed estate in Tacambaro. The Paradian plantation near Pinsandaro and Jarula Hacienda, located in Alima Valley, which all claimed 80 persons. Since Michoacan's sugar planters proved exclusively for a regional market, most slave owners owned fewer than 80 slaves. Existing sources make it difficult to be precise about the ethnic composition of Michoacan's slave population. As active participants in New Spain's domestic slave trade, Michoacan's planters probably acquired a number of enslaved Africans during the first half of the 17th century. In 1635, for instance, when José de Figueroa y Camporo authorized his brothers-in-law to purchase 20 slaves on his behalf, they were likely to find persons defined as Angolans and Congos overrepresented among the available pool of slaves. Doña Isabel Gulen's 17th century estate inventory reveals that proliferation of Africans among the enslaved labor force at Michoacan. This same inventory also underscores a significant black and mulatto presence among the labor force. Based on Doña Isabel's inventory, it seems that blacks and mulattoes rapidly proliferated in 17th century Michoacan. Baptismal records from Michoacan support the contention that the black and mulatto populations steadily expanded during the first half of the 17th century. The Creole population's fecundity precipitated a phenomenal growth rate during the second half of the 17th century among persons defined by themselves and others as blacks and mulattoes. In due course, free Creoles, especially free mulattoes, eclipsed the African and enslaved population. With the exception of the Cordoba region, the evolution of African and Afro-Mestizo population proceeded along similar lines in 17th century Veracruz. At the beginning of the 17th century, a substantial African labor force resided in Cualapa. During the period between 1597 and 1610, planters at Cualapa acquired 330 Africans, or 70% of the total African population they would purchase overall. This expansion of African-born slaves was unprecedented in Walapa. Prior to 1597 and after 1610, the number of Africans that entered the region rarely exceeded 2 or 3 per year. Most of the 478 Africans sold to Walapa's nascent plantocracy toiled and on the sugar estates. After 1610, Walapa's planters were not aggressive buyers of enslaved Africans. Walapa's withdrawal from the international slave trade affected a social and demographic transformation among its resident labor force. By mid-century, Africans had lost their numerical ascendancy among the enslaved and resident laborers, and free persons outnumbered slaves. The demographic patterns on Santissima, Trinidad sugar plantation vividly illustrate the precipitous decline of African slavery in New Spain. In 1608, the slave labor force on the estate numbered 200. 30 years later, only 54 remained. By 1670, the number of slaves had increased, but now represented a smaller percentage of the estate labor force. Meanwhile, the number of free mulattoes and persons of African Indian heritage, parados, had increased to such an extent that they, along with the indigenous peoples, filled the ranks of the wage labor force. Along the size of Santissima, Trinidad's labor force was exceptional. The ethnic patterns and social changes apparent in its labor force manifested themselves throughout Walapa. At the end of the 17th century, the importance of African slaves as a source of labor had waned in Walapa. Ironically, as slavery contracted in Walapa, the institution expanded in Cordoba, thus making the region an exception in 18th century New Spain. As in other areas of New Spain, the waning number of African immigrants precipitated the decline of the slave population. The decline of slavery in New Spain, however, was not synonymous with a decrease in the population of Creoles there. From 1575 to 1675, the percentage of Afro-Veracruzanos, or Creoles, in the slave labor force fluctuated from 33% in 1575 to 14% in 1615 to 51% in 1674. Despite the marked decrease in relative terms between 1575 and 1615, the Creole population continued to grow in absolute terms. The diminishing gap between males and females of African descent sustained this growth. By the end of the 17th century, the ratio of male to female slaves had nearly reached parity. This represented a dramatic shift from the beginning of the 17th century, when the balance favored males over females 3-1. Among the free descendants of Africans, who by the end of the 17th century largely constituted female Creoles, such patterns seemed even more pronounced. Demography as culture. The estate inventories from New Spain reveal two demographic trends among people of African descent beginning in the second half of the 16th century. appearance and behavioral patterns. The term should not obscure the interactions between individuals of European and African descent that was responsible for the emergence of mulattoes, who also represented an important feature of rural society. Colonial records rarely contain evidence of rural mestiçage, since the clergy recorded interracial marriages only sporadically before the 18th century, and in many instances defined those indigenous persons who tried to marry individuals of African descent as mestizos. However, it must be noted that most sexual contact did not lead to marriage. The limited documentary evidence, especially marriage records, strongly supports the scholarly contention that indigenous peoples were restrictive in terms of spouse selection. Even at the end of the colonial period, endogamy represented the norm among most indigenous persons in the central, south, and northwest. Such regions, in fact, recorded endogamy rates of 90% or more, yet the ease with which indigenous persons could pass as mestizos in the proclivities of the clergy made marriage records a problematic, though impressionistic, source with regard to definitional precision. Most persons of indigenous descent who formed liations or positioned for a marriage license with non-Indians define themselves for pecuniary, if not other reasons, as mestizos, or were characterized as such. Also, one cannot ignore the static views that governed Spanish perceptions of who constituted an Indian. Despite the fluidity between the categories of Indian and mestizo, Spaniards continued to imbue these terms with rigid, idyllic, and anachronistic and mutually exclusive meanings. Patterns of interaction were clearly not uniform throughout New Spain. Variations did occur, and in some regions of the central, south, and northwest, where indigenous communities retained their corporate identities along with their corresponding social taboos. Mestizage with persons of African descent happened with less frequency. In this respect, endogamy among the indigenous population coincided, unintentionally, with Spain's imperial design to keep the purported races separated. This demographic overview underscores several neglected dimensions of New Spain's African presence. From New Spain's inception, Africans had a discernible presence. As this population increased in the post-conquest period, New Spain became the largest slave society in the Americas. But in the second half of the 17th century, two related population trends emerged among the slave population that affected the trajectory of slavery and formation of culture in New Spain. Among the enslaved, Creoles emerged as the most populous. As the Creole population increased, the free black population also reached new heights, becoming the largest such community in the Americas. Though mulattoes constituted an important component of this community in the countryside, Afro-mestizos comprised the majority of freed men and freed women. Afro-mestizo ascendancy suggests that the African presence ultimately shifted towards the countryside. Yet, until the middle of the 17th century, and the sizable rural estates notwithstanding, slavery and the African presence was decidedly urban. Slavery in the capital. Scholarly portrayals of slavery in New Spain have thus far emphasized the institution's rural nature. From the 16th century, Africans labored on the rural estates of Morelos, Michoacan, and Oaxaca, and Veracruz. Their variously defined descendants, both slave and free, would inherit these roles, but with the decline of slavery, they increasingly contributed to the growth of the rural peasantry. In New Spain, however, the African presence was not strictly rural. Africans, both slave and servants, occupied an important niche in urban centers. While African labor was essential for workings of the Spanish domestic economies, black also doubled as symbolic capital for a Spanish community perpetually anxious about status. In urban New Spain, Spaniards valued persons of African descent both as laborers and for the cultural capital that they conferred. This duality is essential to an understanding of urban slavery during this time period. Analysis of urban slavery cannot be restricted to chattel slavery with its emphasis on labor. Slaves worked, of course, but they and their descendants also bestowed honor on their owners. Those Spaniards with the greatest pretense to honor owned several slaves, while even modest members of the Spanish community strove to possess at least one slave. In essence, the perceived need to own a slave underscores slavery's centrality in Spanish America's urban central arena. Consequently, in defining a slave society, greater weight should be ascribed to a culturally determined need that led to the persuasive ownership of slaves. This perceived need explains why Mexico City constituted a slave society alongside Morelos, Michoacan, Oaxaca, and Veracruz. As the Spanish capital, Mexico City represented New Spain's most important cultural center within the urban crucible. A new cultural synthesis emerged which was both particular to Mexico and representative of New Spain's ever-shifting cultural moorings. In Mexico, the community of colonizers manifested their vision of enduring dominance over the land and its once sovereign occupants. Nowhere else in New Spain were the competing expressions of colonial power, imperial absolutism, Christian colonialism, and Spanish patrician authority as deeply rooted or as explicitly manifest. To invoke New Spain was to speak of Mexico City. While Mexico's architects reconfigured the social landscape into two distinct republicas, one of the Indian majority and the other for the Spanish minority, they neglected to allot distinctive social space for Africans who lived there. But this omission was not simply an oversight. The African presence, mediated by the experiences of slavery and servitude, represented an extension of Spanish expansion. As such, it did not warrant a distinctive republica. Mastery over Africans and their descendants, in other words, accompanied the Spanish conquest. In the confrontation between Old and New Worlds, the African presence embodied Spanish cultural continuity. By establishing their cultural dominance, the conquerors imposed long-standing Spanish cultural norms and practices, including a recent acquired mastery over African slaves and servants as their legacy. From this perspective, Africans and their descendants stood for more than labor, and they constituted symbolic capital doubling as a cultural legacy. Like writing, walled cities, wheat, olives, and wine, Spaniards relied on the servile African population to signify their cultural identity as the civilized. By the time of the conquest, mastery over Africans was tantamount to being a Spaniard. Spanish mastery, however, resided not in the African's race, but in the authority and honor conferred in displays of conspicuous consumption. Travelers routinely commented on the symbolic importance of New Spain's African presence. These comments often followed standard refrains about Spanish sloth, ostentation, and arrogance. For several observers, including Thomas Gage, these qualities, along with the African presence, contributed to the rampant vice, sin, and moral degeneracy that they saw enveloping Mexico City. In 1625, Thomas Gage spent 5 months in Mexico. Like many other observers, Gage was awed by the noblest city in all India. The city's grandeur, the size of its streets and promenades, and its structures impressed him, as they did other contemporary visitors. More than once, Gage remarked that buildings are with stone and brick very strong, the streets are very broad, in the narrowest of them 3 coaches may go, or coaches. On the basis of the structural splendor, Gage identified Mexico as one of the greatest cities in the world. Wealth accompanied grandeur. Dazzled by the display of wealth, Gage described in detail the liveries. He remarked upon the beauty of some of the coaches of the gentry, which do exceed in cost the best of the court of Madrid and other parts of Christendom. For they spare no silver, nor gold, nor precious stones, nor cloth of gold, nor the best silks from China to enrich them. After this assessment, Gage pointed out that men and women are excessive in their apparel, using more silks than stuffs and cloth. The excess of the Spaniards was evidently quite contagious, since nay a blackamoor or tawny young maid and slave will make hard shift, but she will be in fashion with her neck chain and bracelets of pearls, and her ear-bobs of some considerable jewels. The attire of this baser sort of blackamoors and mulattoes is so light, and their carriage so enticing, that many Spaniards, even of the better sort, who are too prone to venery, disdain their wives for them. In Mexico, a culture of excess had emerged, in which even slaves and their descendants participated, and explains Gage's insistence that he found little but sin and wickedness. Sensitive to the ways that Africans figured in ostentatious displays of honor and status, Gage nonetheless did not refer to Mexico City as a slave society. Through his observations, however, Mexico's slave society comes into relief, a society in which the master-slave relationship provided the model for all social relations. Present in significant numbers, both African slaves and Afro-Mexican servants occupied prominent roles in an economy structured by circulation, production, and consumption. But rather than describe Mexico City as a slave society on the basis of the slave's role as labor in the economy, Gage captured something much more elusive. He glimpsed the African's prominence in spectacles of ostentation that in turn mirrored social relations at large. In lieu of sources capable of delineating with any precision 16th and 17th century urban slave-holding patterns, we must rely on other sources related to the slave experience in order to understand urban slavery. Such records, as well as we shall see, suggest that most urban slaves labored as domestics, artisans, and vendors, occupations that placed them in daily contact with persons similarly defined and with a host of pueblans of various hues. They of course interacted with a diverse range of Spaniards. In doing so, the enslaved learned to navigate in and between the households and various institutions comprising the Spanish society. Though life in cities offered the enslaved a specific challenge, constant supervision, it also afforded them opportunities to circumvent their master's authority. As urban masters imposed their authority over enslaved, they confronted royal and ecclesiastical officials who respectively defined slaves as vassals and persons with souls. Africans and their descendants learned that conflicting obligations and rights accompanied the disparate identities ascribed to baptized slaves. Many, as the subsequent chapters reveal, became adept at manipulating their conflicting status as chattel, as vassals, and as Christians.